From being crushed by a bus to being eaten by a whale. Welcome back, everyone. Here you're about to see the most amazing survival stories of people who defied death itself. First, we have to look at Stephen McCormack. Stephen McCormack was an experienced truck driver who had spent years hauling goods throughout New Zealand. So when he started fixing his truck one day, he felt confident about the job. Unfortunately, he got cocky and paid the price. He was working on his trailer when he slipped and fell. He was wedged perfectly between the truck's bumper and the trailer. He figured he'd managed to escape any serious injury, but he couldn't shake this weird feeling. It was like his body was expanding like a balloon. It turned out his bottom had been crushed by the truck. That part of the vehicle has a brass valve that supplies compressed air to the brakes. The valve had been weakened due to corrosion and poked into his butt. This shot pressurized air directly into his bloodstream. His colleagues watched in horror as his body started inflating. He was then rushed to the hospital. An ambulance was dispatched, but both emergency vehicles in the area were busy. So he waited in terrible pain for an entire hour. When he finally arrived at the hospital, doctors knew how serious his condition was. The air had separated fat tissue from muscle, filling his abdomen, chest, and even the spaces around his lungs, heart, and behind his eyelids. He struggled to breathe, so doctors inserted a tube through his ribs and into his lungs to assist him. They knew there wasn't much else they could do. The trapped air would have to leave his body naturally. His son said it was like trying to blow up a balloon and then letting the air out. It took 3 days for all the air to be expelled from his body in fart form. Amazingly, he made a full recovery. Doctors later said that if the valve punctured another part of his body, it could have damaged a blood vessel and killed him instantly. Next, we have to look at Joan Murray. Joan Murray was an experienced skydiver who had jumped out of planes many times before. She had completed 35 jumps, including tandem dives with her kids. So when she went on a dive with her husband in Australia, she felt prepared. She and her husband stood on the open door of a plane at 13,000 feet. It was time to jump. They put their helmets on and checked their equipment one last time before jumping. Joan's parachute deployed successfully and she started floating down to Earth. At 120 miles per hour, she started preparing to land. Unfortunately, her parachute failed to inflate. She tried multiple times to fix it, but it was beyond repair. She had no choice but to reach for her reserve parachute. Thankfully, this deployed successfully, and she floated gently down to Earth. But yet another problem soon arose. The cords became entangled into a knot, rendering it useless. She was plummeting to Earth at 80 miles per hour. Suddenly, she heard a loud crack before everything went black. She had crashed into the ground. Fortunately, by pure chance, she landed directly on a fire ant nest, instead of dying. She was stung and bitten by over 200 angry ants. Their venom stimulated her nervous system and kept her heart beating. It may sound painful, but it ended up saving her life. She woke up from a coma 2 weeks later and made a full recovery. Doctors had to perform multiple reconstructive surgeries and blood transfusions, as the entire right side of her body had been crushed. Next, we have to look at Margaret Guire. Margaret Guire and her husband Herbert had just gotten married in Canada in 1915 to celebrate. They decided to take a trip across the Atlantic on the RMS Lusitania. They boarded the ship in New York City and were excited to explore Europe, but disaster struck on April 7, 1915. At 8:50 p.m., the ship was sailing off the Irish coast, when suddenly it was struck by a torpedo fired by a German submarine. Margaret and Herbert were having dinner in the ship's dining room when the loud boom was heard. The couple immediately raced to a lifeboat. Margaret shared the boat with 3 other women and a baby. But as she looked up, she saw the ship's massive smokestacks above them. She feared they might collapse. In a moment of panic, she climbed back up to the deck, while Herbert, believing she was safe, boarded another lifeboat. The Lusitania sank rapidly and Margaret tried to swim away from the wreckage, but was pulled into one of the smokestacks by a whirlpool. Miraculously, a sudden explosion blasted her back to the surface. She was eventually rescued by a nearby lifeboat. When she turned to wave to the rescuers, she saw Herbert in another boat crying, believing she had died. He was overjoyed to see that she had survived. Next, we have to look at Julie McSorley and Liz Cottrell. Julie McSorley and Liz Cottrell were kayaking in San Luis Obispo, California. They were excited because humpback whales had gathered in the bay. The whales were feeding on fish, and the pair wanted to get a closer look. It was a beautiful day, and lots of tourists were nearby in boats and kayaks. Although whale watching is popular, safety experts recommend staying at least 300 feet away from the feeding zone. Unfortunately, the 2 friends misjudged the distance. Suddenly, a tightly packed swarm of fish, known as a bait ball, moved dangerously close to them. But they weren't the only ones to notice. The whales had also seen it. Before they could react, a humpback lunged forward to swallow the fish, but also scooped up Julie and Liz, trapping them in its massive mouth. They probably thought they were about to be swallowed whole. After all, humpbacks can grow up to 56 feet long. But despite their size, humpbacks have relatively small throats, only about the size of a human fist, and no teeth. The whale's natural instinct is to spit out anything that isn't fish, and that's exactly what it did. Moments later, Julie and Liz resurfaced unharmed. Next, we have to look at Matthew Lowe. Matthew Lowe was on his way to his factory one day when he stopped to check something. As he walked past an automated conveyor belt, his overalls snagged. Within seconds, his entire body was forced through the narrow tunnel. He could hear his bones cracking as the machine spat him out on the other side. Miraculously, he remained conscious. His co-workers rushed to his aid and he was rushed to the hospital. Doctors told his partner to prepare for the worst, but amazingly, Matthew survived. He had suffered a broken spine, a torn abdomen, and multiple cracked ribs and a shattered pelvis. He underwent 6 surgeries and spent a month in the hospital, and 18 months later, he made a full recovery and even returned to work. Finally, we have to look at Taiba. Taiba was a young Indian girl who loved playing outside. One day, she was exploring a nearby construction site. She wandered into an area filled with debris and half-finished structures. As she walked, she tripped and fell neck-first onto a long metal rod protruding from a brick. Bystanders witnessed the horrifying scene and called for help. At the hospital, doctors were stunned. The rod had missed all vital nerves and blood vessels in her head. After a 35-minute surgery, they were able to remove it successfully. Amazingly, she was discharged just 3 days later. Had she fallen just a few inches differently, she would have died. Now it's time for a bonus section, and we have to look at Frane Selleck. Frane Selleck is known as both the luckiest and unluckiest man alive. In 1962, the train he was on derailed into a freezing river. Many died, but Frane swam to shore with just a broken arm. In 1963, he was on a small plane when both engines failed. He was sucked out mid-flight, but landed on a haystack and survived. Everyone else on board perished. In 1965, a bus he was riding skidded off a bridge into a river, killing 4. Frane survived again. In 1970, his car engine burst into flames. He escaped just in time. In 1973, another car fire left him with burns, but he lived. In 1975, he was hit by a bus but survived. In 1976, his car plunged off a mountain road. He jumped out mid-fall, landed in a tree, and lived while the car exploded below. And to top it all off, he won the lottery in 2003. But now, it's time for you to make your voice heard. Which of these people do you think was the luckiest? Comment below. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to like and share with your friends. If you want to see more videos like this one, stay tuned.